As we're moving into, well, it's Martin Luther King's birthday. At least this is the weekend that we celebrate it. And as I was thinking about our vision this year, which I always have to kind of make sure I have it right, I want to throw different words in. Perfect vision, seeing through a spiritual lens. It occurred to me, Martin Luther King Jr. definitely saw through a spiritual lens. He's organizing, and he himself, as a black man, has been through all sorts of discrimination, and if not been the recipient of violence, at least it would have observed a lot of violence in those times. And if he was seeing through an ego lens, or what we often call the worldly lens, the ego's all about a tit for a tat, right? If you're going to make me uncomfortable, you're going to be uncomfortable. If you're going to attack me, then I'm going to attack you. But that wasn't Martin Luther King's message at all. In fact, he brought a very Eastern message to the West, the rough riding West, right? Of we can't meet violence with violence. All we get ultimately is more violence. Even if we're able to squash the violence for now, violence brings up resentment, shame, all sorts of strong feelings that then come back out. We have more conflict, more war. We're not able to come to live together out of love, out of peace, out of joy. And it made me curious. What on earth did this man have as a spiritual practice that allowed him to transcend all of his upbringing and to stand firmly in this message? It turns out he had an amazing prayer life. And for him, his prayer, I can actually pull up my notes now because there's some great things. I found a book called Never to Leave Us Alone, The Prayer Life of Martin Luther King Jr. And in there, it tells us that King had a daily conversation and walk with God through prayer. And he used prayer as a time to really just bare his soul, that his God was someone that he wanted to be very close to and intimate with. He held nothing back. And he felt that it was imperative to not only have this daily time of prayer, but to also have a time in the silence. And it was fun to read that in every worship service that he created, there was always time for the silence. That it was important to not only not only to share about what was going on, but to pose questions and to listen. Sounds familiar, right? We do the same thing here. And when they were quoting them, they said, for King, one must, and in quotes, sustain a life of prayer. This involves a profound surrender of the self to God. And this is, I think, what we see in him, this profound surrender of self to God. And when we say self, I think you understand we're talking about the small self, the self that feels separate, the part of us that can be frightened by the world, that feels that we need to protect ourselves, that we can't fully be out there. And a great story was retold by King of one night, almost right at the strike of midnight, he received a call from a racist who not only, you can imagine how the call went, but also the caller went on to say that he was going to, if he did not cease, that he was going to burn down his house and kill him. And you can imagine too, that would do harm to his family. And Martin Luther King couldn't sleep. And And he also had this very clear realization that all of his education, all of his life experience did not prepare him for how to respond to this moment. And so what did he do? Such a great example for each of us. He turned to prayer. And he began this conversation, you can imagine, not afraid to say, I'm frightened. What can I do here? And he received a response. Great comfort came as an inner voice spoke to King, reminding him that he was not alone, commanding him to stand up for righteousness, justice, and truth, and assuring him that, lo, I will be with you, even to the end of the world. One thing I will say is that he was deeply steeped in the Bible. Our guidance always uses language that is meaningful to us. But how powerful. Lo, I will be with you, even to the end of the world. That we are never alone. And you get the sense of surrender that's required in a message like that, and yet you also get the sense of purpose, right? That, yes, this is what is mine to do. In Unity, we talk about the still small voice. Which is that voice that Martin Luther King heard that night. Which can be a voice, it can be just a knowing, but it's always quiet. And it just sort of lands in our consciousness. And so I became curious about the scripture, which is found in 1 Kings 19, verses 11 through 12. Let's look at it. And behold, the Lord passed by in a great and strong... let me tell you a little bit of let me give you some background on this first. It'll help you. So you could leave that up, but this is dealing with the prophet Elijah. And Elijah is on the run. Jezebel has put out a decree that all prophets should be killed, and all of them have been killed except for Elijah. And remember, prophets are people that have the gift of prophecy. They have the gift of speaking what God has in mind, what Spirit has in mind. And so he's running, and he's asking for help here from God. And he really wants big help from God, right? Like he wants a big God that can protect him, which is really something that we all have an opportunity to look at. We want to be saved from something, get me out of this situation. I promise to be good if you'll just take care of me here, right? So now let's go through the scripture. And behold, the Lord, so he finds himself in a cave, and he's praying, and God says, go to the mouth of the cave. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after with the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Many interpretations. I read several over the last day or two. Of course, one of them is that Spirit doesn't need to act in big ways, that the power of Spirit is in just the guidance. But one of the narratives really touched me, where the narrator said, in this quest we have to find something that will take care of us, this scripture and the way guidance comes to us, just as a simple knowing, and not of the whole plan, usually just the next step, is actually revealing to us that the great power lies within. that we are the powerful one that takes the message and brings it out into the world. And that our role is to have that clarity of vision, right? To be able to hear the truth, and to bring it forth. And that everything that we will need to bring it forth, to face every challenge, is already within us, ready to come forth. As I spoke about last week, our souls may need to practice to know how to bring that forth, but the same potential that is in Martin Luther King, or was in Martin Luther King, is the exact same potential in us. For you see, we are all expression of the same nature. We are all expression of the same Spirit, the very same Spirit. It's just a matter of how our soul expresses it. What is our soul's to do in this lifetime? The still small voice can come to us in many ways. Charles Fillmore, co-founder of Unity, talked about waiting in the silence until he heard the still small voice. And so he would sometimes meditate 4 hours a day. For me, it's a different experience. I rarely hear anything during my meditation time. But when I come out of the meditation time, and often when I'm just doing something mindless like driving or making my breakfast, because I meditate in the morning, suddenly it descends on me, like, oh, that's what I'm talking about this week, or that's what's mine to do in this situation, or that's what needs to be done. And so I encourage you to understand that while those of us in the role of speaking to you about spirituality often speak from our own experience, to not discount your experience. Because you see, your soul is going to hold and respond and express this thing called spirit in its own unique way. Let it be unique. However that knowing comes to you. And also, I wanted to just mention, I guess I should make sure I'm mentioning everything. Yes, I am. I wanted to mention Pierre Pradevan's work around the blessing of the unfolding that he brought up in this book, The Gentle Art of Blessing, that we worked with last fall, where he encouraged us to understand that everything that's happening in our life is a blessing, particularly if we have any kind of negative response to it, if we're uncomfortable with it, or if we're having a more pronounced challenge with it, because we can have a lot of reactivity around life, right? That it's showing us some area where our consciousness is not open. You see, through his prayer and meditation, Martin Luther King was able to create that space that I think is so important for opening. Or I was reading in another tradition where they talked about the purification of the soul. Because Charles Fillmore used to say, when a belief has landed firmly in our consciousness, and it lands there because there is some issue that lets us think that it's imperative that we believe this, that they actually crystallize. And those crystals just fill up our consciousness. Today we talk about them as just structures, that the ego is structured beliefs in our consciousness. But boy, do they like to eat up consciousness, eat up our bandwidth, eat up our memory, if you will. And so he's saying any time that we have some kind of reaction, it's pointing to a structured area of our consciousness, something that's filling us unnecessarily. And that we have an opportunity through the examination of that to free up even more space, to purify, clarify that consciousness so that there is plenty of room for spirit. And to me, it's funny how subtle it can be. I mean, sometimes it's gross, right? But it all can be very subtle. Like 2 weeks ago, Stuart and I are trying to spend more time up at Grand Lake. And so we've identified a place where we rent. The first couple of years, we managed to get 4 days in. That's all he could give us, is how popular this place is. But this year, he said, oh, someone has canceled for June, so I can give you a week in June. And he just emailed us 2 weeks ago and said, hey, I can give you the first week of September. They just canceled. The universe has a funny way of not making it real cut and dry, right? We already have a vacation planned for the first week of September. We always go back to my family's lake house in Clear Lake, Iowa, the first week of September, always. So we're in this quandary. Well, what do we do? And, well, could we? And eventually I said to Stuart, well, where do you want to go? And he goes, well, I want to go to Grand Lake. Probably doesn't want to see my mother, you know, or something going on there. But what that brought up for me was part of that trip for me is helping close up our cabin. It's part of my being of service so that we can continue to have this place as my mother ages. And so I started looking at, well, when else could I go? And I found 2 other weeks in the summer that actually I have nothing going on. I'm not responsible here. It's great having a co-minister, right? And I thought, wow, isn't this interesting? I've worked here now for 16 years, and I used to go to the lake 1 week every month, starting in May until October, before I worked here. And when I got here, there wasn't time for that. And I brought it down to 3 times. And I'm just locked into, I can go to the lake 3 times, right? Isn't that interesting? I thought, where the heck did I? Just shows you how we just get into these patterns, right? I could go 5 times this year. There's 2 more weeks that I could go, right? But something very interesting came up when I said I could do that. I felt anxious. And I had to go in and see what that is. Because you see, there's always fuel behind anything we do. If there's a pattern, there's some kind of fuel driving the pattern. And in my childhood, I got rewarded for serving my parents. And I was often shamed when I came forward with what I wanted. There was no space, I was one of 5 kids. It wasn't overt shaming, but it was, we don't have the time for that, and what are you thinking? And that kind of stuff that leaves you feeling like, I'm taking up too much space here. But when I did something for them, it was all about praise. Like mowed the yard, or helped with the other kids, or cleaned up after dinner. I'm uncomfortable with saying, I want to be gone to our lake cabin 5 weeks this summer. And yet, as I came to that realization, you can address that. You can address that square on. You can be with yourself. You can comfort yourself, this young part of you that's frightened. And in that, you take care of yourself. The daily word today was fascinating to me. It said, this is from the book of Luke, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." You don't need to be afraid, little one. It's the Father's good pleasure for you to be happy. All you need to do is stand in your truth and see what happens. It may be that I don't get to go for 5 weeks, but how much more fun it is to explore going than to say, I only go for 3 weeks. If we're going to have perfect vision, if we're going to see through a spiritual lens, it requires that there be space in our consciousness. In this movement, we'll call it, in the unity movement, we highly encourage you to practice prayer and meditation like Martin Luther King did, because it has a way of creating that space, of orienting ourselves to the Spirit, and of allowing ourselves to be vulnerable with Spirit, to let down some of our guard, to be able to hear and to know the truth. Recognize that that still small voice may come to you in different ways than what you read about, but you'll recognize the knowing. Oh, here's the truth for me. And to also understand that everything that's unfolding in your life is working to break you free, is working to allow you to be just that relaxed, spacious consciousness that is there to serve the light. Part of that serving is to take care of yourself, to know what nurtures you, what regenerates you, so you can be fully out there. That's part of the truth. In our own small way. Martin Luther King, he was the light in a big way. But you see, by creating space in our consciousness, by opening up that spiritual lens, we too will have impact on those in the world around us. So let's move into a time of meditation now. And while we've just given you, or I've given you, a lot to think about, to remember that meditation is a time of focusing our attention on something other than the chatter of the ego. And so, gently now, move your attention to your heart, or to the movement of your breath if it's easier to stay with something that's active, or to the quietness of your belly and the cost center, your very center of gravity. When you find yourself coming back to the chatter of the ego, to the to-do list, to what's next today, gently bring yourself back to your heart, to your belly, to your breath. We're practicing listening. Listening for the still, small voice of Spirit. And through this act of putting our attention somewhere else, we are creating space for Spirit. And so for the next several minutes, we allow ourselves to sit in the silence together.